Alright, I'll let this song play out, and then it's on to the sequences. Okay, let us now move on. So I decided not to do the highlights from the sequences for now, but to go with the full sequences. Um, I really it's at least partially just because the full ones are so much longer, and the highlights just like skip over a lot of things that I still think are enjoyable or like nice to read. Uh, yeah, let's get started with it. We start with the sequence called Predictably Wrong. This, the first book of Rationality, AI to Zombies, also known as the sequences, begins with cognitive bias. The rest of the book won't stick to just this topic. Bad habits and bad ideas matter even when they arise from our mind's contents as opposed to our mind's structure. It is cognitive bias, however, that provides the clearest and most direct glimpse into the stuff of our psychology, into the shape of our heuristics and the logic of our limitations. It is with bias that we will begin. Preface. You hold in your hands a compilation of 2 years of daily blog posts. In retrospect, I look back on that project and see a large number of things I did completely wrong. I'm fine with that. Looking back and not seeing a huge number of things I did wrong would mean that neither my writing nor my understanding had improved since 2009. Oops is the sound we make when we improve our beliefs and strategies. So to look back at a time and not see anything you did wrong means you haven't learned anything or changed your mind since then. It was a mistake that I didn't write my 2 years of blog posts with the intention of helping people do better in their everyday lives. I wrote it with the intention of helping people solve big, difficult, important problems, and I chose impressive sounding, abstract problems as my examples. In retrospect, this was the second largest mistake in my approach. It ties in to the first largest mistake in my writing, which was that I didn't realize that the big problem in learning this valuable way of thinking was figuring out how to practice it, not knowing the theory. I didn't realize that part was the priority, and regarding this, I can only say oops and duh. Yes, sometimes those big issues really are big and really are important, but that doesn't change the basic truth that to master skills you need to practice them, and it's harder to practice on things that are further away. Today, the Center for Applied Rationality is working on repairing this huge mistake of mine in a more systematic fashion. A third huge mistake I made was to focus too much on rational belief, too little on rational action. The fourth largest mistake I made was that I should have better organized the content I was presenting in the sequences. In particular, I should have created a wiki much earlier and made it easier to read the posts in sequence. That mistake, at least, is correctable. In the present work, Rob Bensinger has reordered the posts and reorganized them as much as he can without trying to rewrite all the actual material, though he's rewritten a bit of it. My fifth mistake was that I, as I saw it, tried to speak plainly about the stupidity of what appeared to me to be stupid ideas. I did try to avoid the fallacy known as bulverism, which is where you open your discussion by talking about how stupid people are for believing something. I would always discuss the issue first and only afterwards say, and so this is stupid. But in 2009, it was an open question in my mind whether it might be important to have some people around who expressed contempt for homeopathy. I thought, and still do think, that there is an unfortunate problem wherein treating ideas courteously is processed by many people on some level as nothing bad will happen to me if I say I believe this, I won't lose status if I say I believe in homeopathy. Homeopathy. And that derisive laughter by comedians can help people wake up from the dream. Today I would write more courteously, I think. The discourtesy did serve a function, and I think there were people who were helped by reading it. But I now take more seriously the risk of building communities where the normal and expected reaction to low status outsider views is open mockery and contempt. Despite my mistake, I am happy to say that my readership has so far been amazingly good about not using my rhetoric as an excuse to bully or belittle others. I want to single out Scott Alexander in particular here, who is a nicer person than I am and an increasingly amazing writer on these topics, and may deserve part of the credit for making the culture of less wrong a healthy one. To be able to look backwards and say that you've failed implies that you had goals. So, what was it that I was trying to do? There is a certain valuable way of thinking, which is not yet taught in schools in this present day. This certain way of thinking is not taught systematically at all. It is just absorbed by people who grow up reading books like Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, or who have an unusually great teacher in high school. Most famously, this certain way of thinking has to do with science and with the experimental method. The part of science where you go out and look at the universe instead of just making things up. The part where you say, oops, and give up on that theory when the experiments don't support it. But this certain way of thinking extends beyond that. It is deeper and more universal than a pair of goggles you put on when you enter a laboratory and take off when you leave. It applies to daily life, though this part is subtler and more difficult. But if you can't say oops and give up when it looks like something isn't working, you have no choice but to keep shooting yourself in the foot. You have to keep reloading the shotgun and you have to keep pulling the trigger. You know people like this. And somewhere, someplace in your life, you would rather not think about you are people like this. It would be nice if there was a certain way of thinking that could help us stop doing that. In spite of how large my mistakes were, those 2 years of blog posting appeared to help a surprising number of people a surprising amount. It didn't work reliably, but it worked sometimes. In modern society, so little is taught of the skills of rational belief and decision making, so little of the mathematics and sciences underlying them, that it turns out that just reading through a massive brain dump full of problems in philosophy and science can, yes, be surprisingly good for you. Walking through all of that from a dozen different angles can sometimes convey a glimpse of the central rhythm. Because it is all, in the end, one thing. I talked about big, important, distant problems and neglected immediate life, but the laws governing them aren't actually different. There are huge gaps in which parts I focused on, and I picked all the wrong examples, but it is all, in the end, one thing. I am proud to look back and say that, even after all the mistakes I made, and all the other times I said oops, even 5 years later, it still appears to me that this is better than nothing. Biases. An introduction. Imagine reaching into an urn that contains 70 white balls and 30 red ones, and plucking out 10 mystery balls. Perhaps 3 of the 10 balls will be red, and you will correctly guess how many red balls total were in the urn. Or perhaps you'll happen to grab 4 red balls or some other number. Then you'll probably get the total number wrong. This random error is the cost of incomplete knowledge, and as errors go, it's not so bad. Your estimates won't be incorrect on average, and the more you learn, the smaller your error will tend to be. On the other hand, suppose that the white balls are heavier and sink to the bottom of the urn. Then your sample may be unrepresentative in a consistent direction. That kind of error is called statistical bias. When your method of learning about the world is biased, learning more may not help. Acquiring more data can even consistently worsen a biased prediction. If you're used to holding knowledge and inquiry in high esteem, this is a scary prospect. If we want to be sure that learning more will help us, rather than making us worse off than we were before, we need to discover and correct for biases in our data. The idea of cognitive bias in psychology works in an analogous way. A cognitive bias is the systematic error in how we think, as opposed to a random error or one that's merely caused by our ignorance. Whereas statistical bias skews the sample so that it less closely resembles a larger population, cognitive biases skew our thinking so that it less accurately tracks the truth or less reliably serves our other goals. Maybe you have an optimism bias and you find out that the red balls can be used to treat a rare tropical disease besetting your brother, and you end up overestimating how many red balls the urn contains because you wish the balls were mostly red. Like statistical biases, cognitive biases can distort our view of reality. They can't always be fixed by just gathering more data, and their effects can add up over time. But when the miscalibrated measuring instrument you're trying to fix is you, debiasing is a unique challenge. Still, this is an obvious place to start, for if you can't trust your brain, how can you trust anything else? Noticing bias. Imagine meeting someone for the first time and knowing nothing about them except that they're shy. Question: is it more likely that this person is a librarian or a salesperson? Most people answer librarian, which is a mistake. Shy salespeople are more common than shy librarians, because salespeople in general are much more common than librarians, 75 times as common in the United States. This is base rate neglect, grounding one's judgment in how well sets of characteristics feel like they fit together, and neglecting how common each characteristic is in a population at large. Another example of a cognitive bias is the sunk cost fallacy, people's tendency to feel committed to things they've spent resources on in the past, when they should be cutting their losses and moving on. Knowing about these biases, unfortunately, doesn't make you immune to them. It doesn't even mean you'll be able to notice them in action. In a study of bias blindness, experimental subjects predicted that they would have a harder time neutrally evaluating the quality of paintings if they knew the paintings were by famous artists. And indeed, these subjects exhibited the very bias they had predicted when the experimenters later tested their prediction. When asked afterward, however, the very same subjects claimed that their assessments of the paintings had been objective and unaffected by the bias. Even when we correctly identify others' biases, we exhibit a bias blind spot when it comes to our own flaws. Failing to detect any biased feeling thoughts when we introspect, we draw the conclusion that we must just be less biased than everyone else. Yet, it is possible to recognize and overcome biases. It's just not trivial. It's known that subjects can reduce base rate neglect, for example, by thinking of probabilities as frequencies of objects or events. The approach to de-biasing in this book is to communicate a systematic understanding of why good reasoning works and of how the brain falls short of it. To the extent that this volume does its job, its approach can be compared to the one described in Surface 2010, who notes that years of financially related work experience did not affect people's susceptibility to the sunk cost bias, whereas the number of accounting courses attended did help. Quote, as a consequence, it might be necessary to distinguish between experience and expertise, with expertise meaning the development of a schematic principle that involves conceptual understanding of the problem, which in turn enables the decision maker to recognize particular biases. However, using expertise as countermeasure requires more than just being familiar with the situational content or being an expert in a particular domain. It requires that one fully understand the underlying rationale of the respective bias, is able to spot it in the particular setting, and also has the appropriate tools at hand to counteract the bias. The goal of this book is to lay the groundwork for creating rationality expertise. That means acquiring a deep understanding of the structure of a very general problem, human bias, self-deception, and the thousand paths by which sophisticated thought can defeat itself. A word about this text. Map and Territory began its life as a series of essays by decision theorist Alexei Yudkowsky, published between 2006 and 2009 on the economics blog Overcoming Bias and its spin-off community blog Less Wrong. Thematically linked essays were grouped together in sequences, and thematically linked sequences were grouped into books. Map and Territory is the first of 6 such books, with the series as a whole going by the name Rationality from AI to Zombies. In style, this series runs the gamut from lively textbook to compendium of vignettes to riotous manifesto, and the content is correspondingly varied. The resultant rationality primer is frequently personal and irreverent, drawing, for example, from Yudkowsky's experiences with his Orthodox Jewish mother, a psychiatrist, and father, a physicist, and from conversations on chat rooms and mailing lists. Readers who are familiar with Yudkowsky from Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality, his science-oriented takeoff of J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter books, will recognize the same iconoclasm and many of the same themes. The philosopher Alfred Korzybski once wrote, "A map is not the territory it represents, but, if correct, it has a similar structure to the territory which accounts for its usefulness." And what can be said of maps here, as Korzybski noted, can also be said of beliefs and assertions and words. The map is not the territory. This deceptively simple claim is the organizing idea behind this book, and behind the 4 sequences of essays collected here. Predictably Wrong, which concerns the systematic ways our beliefs fail to map the real world. Fake Beliefs, on what makes a belief a map in the first place. Noticing Confusion, on how this world mapping thing our brains do actually works. And Mysterious Answers, which collides these points together. The book then concludes with the simple truth. a standalone dialogue on the idea of truth itself. Humans aren't rational, but, as behavioral economist Dan Ariely notes, we are predictably irrational. There are patterns to how we screw up, and there are patterns to how we behave when we don't screw up. Both admit of fuller understanding, and with it, the hope of leaning on that understanding to build a better future for ourselves. Scope insensitivity. Once upon a time, 3 groups of subjects were asked how much they would pay to save 2,000, 20,000, 200,000 migrating birds from drowning in uncovered oil ponds. The groups respectively answered $80, $78, and $88. This is scope insensitivity or scope neglect. The number of birds saved, the scope of the altruistic action, had little effect on willingness to pay. Similar experiments showed that Toronto residents would pay little more to clean up all polluted lakes in Ontario than polluted lakes in a particular region of Ontario, or that residents of 4 western US states would pay only 28% more to protect all 57 wilderness areas in those states than to protect a single area. People visualize a single exhausted bird, its feathers soaked in black oil, unable to escape. This image, or prototype, calls forth some level of emotional arousal that is primarily responsible for willingness to pay, and the image is the same in all cases. As for scope, it gets tossed out the window. No human can visualize 2,000 birds at once, let alone 200,000. The usual finding is that exponential increases in scope create linear increases in willingness to pay, perhaps corresponding to the linear time for our eyes to glaze over the zeros. This small amount of affect is added, not multiplied, with the prototype affect. This hypothesis is known as valuation by prototype. An alternative hypothesis is purchase of moral satisfaction. People spend enough money to create a warm glow in themselves, a sense of having done their duty. The level of spending needed to purchase a warm glow depends on personality and financial situation, but it certainly has nothing to do with the number of birds. We are insensitive to scope, even when human lives are at stake. Increasing the alleged risk of chlorinated drinking water from 0.004 to 2.43 annual deaths per 1,000, a factor of 600, increased willingness to pay from $3.78 to $15.23. Barron and Green found no effect from varying lives saved by a factor of 10. A paper entitled Insensitivity to the Value of Human Life, a Study of Psychophysical Numbing, collected evidence that our perception of human deaths follow Weber's law. It obeys a logarithmic scale where the just noticeable difference is a constant fraction of the whole. A proposed health program to save the lives of Rwandan refugees garnered far higher support when it promised to save 4,500 lives in a camp of 11,000 refugees, rather than 4,500 in a camp of 250,000. A potential disease cure had to promise to save far more lives in order to be judged worthy of funding, if the disease was originally stated to have killed 290,000 rather than 160,000 or 15,000 people per year. The moral: if you want to be an effective altruist, you have to think it through with a part of your brain that processes those unexciting, inky zeros on paper, not just the part that gets real worked up about that poor, struggling, oil-soaked bird. Small break to drink, and then, yeah. The martial art of rationality. I often use the metaphor that rationality is the martial art of mind. You don't need huge, bulging muscles. You don't need huge, bulging muscles to learn martial arts. There's a tendency toward more athletic people being more likely to learn martial arts, but that may be a matter of enjoyment as much as anything else. If you have a hand with tendons and muscles in the appropriate places, then you can learn to make a fist. Similarly, if you have a brain with cortical and subcortical areas in the appropriate places, you might be able to learn to use it properly. If you're a fast learner, you might learn faster. But the art of rationality isn't about that. It's about training brain machinery we all have in common. And where there are systematic errors human brains tend to make, like an insensitivity to scope, rationality is about fixing those mistakes or finding workarounds. Alas, our minds respond less readily to our will than our hands. Our ability to control our muscles is evolutionarily ancient. Our ability to reason about our own reasoning processes is a much more recent innovation. We shouldn't be surprised, then, that muscles are easier to use than brains. But it is not wise to neglect the latter training because it is more difficult. It is not by bigger muscles that the human species rose to prominence upon Earth. If you live in an urban area, you probably don't need to walk very far to find a martial arts dojo. Why aren't there dojos that teach rationality? One reason, perhaps, is that it's harder to verify skill. To rise a level in Taekwondo, you might need to break a board of a certain width. If you succeed, all the onlookers can see and applaud. If you fail, your teacher can watch how you shape a fist and check if you shape it correctly. If not, the teacher holds out a hand and makes a fist correctly, so that you can observe how to do so. Within martial arts schools, techniques of muscle have been refined and elaborated over generations. Techniques of rationality are harder to pass on, even to the most willing student. Very recently, in just the last few decades, the human species has acquired a great deal of new knowledge about human rationality. The most salient example would be the heuristics and biases program in experimental psychology. There is also the Bayesian systematization of probability theory and statistics, evolutionary psychology, social psychology, experimental investigations of empirical human psychology, and theoretical probability theory to interpret what our experiments tell us, and evolutionary theory to explain the conclusions. These fields give us new, focusing lenses through which to view the landscape of our own minds. With their aid, we may be able to see more clearly the muscles of our brains, the fingers of thought, as they move. We have a shared vocabulary in which to describe problems and solutions. Humanity may finally be ready to synthesize the martial art of mind, to refine, share, systematize, and pass on techniques of personal rationality. Such understanding as I have of rationality, I acquired in the course of wrestling with the challenge of artificial general intelligence, an endeavor which, to actually succeed, would require sufficient mastery of rationality to build a complete working rationalist out of toothpicks and rubber bands. In most ways, the AI problem is enormously more demanding than the personal art of rationality, but in some ways it is actually easier. In the martial art of mind, we need to acquire the real-time procedural skill of pulling the right levers at the right time on a large pre-existing thinking machine whose innards are not end-user modifiable. Some of the machinery is optimized for evolutionary selection pressures that run directly counter to our declared goals in using it. Deliberately, we decide that we want to seek only the truth, but our brains have hardwired support for rationalizing falsehoods. We can try to compensate for what we choose to regard as flaws of the machinery, but we can't actually rewire the neural circuitry. Nor may martial artists plate titanium over their bones. Not today, at any rate. Trying to synthesize a personal art of rationality using the science of rationality may prove awkward. One imagines trying to invent a martial art using an abstract theory of physics, game theory, and human anatomy. But humans are not reflectively blind. We do have a native instinct for introspection. The inner eye isn't sightless, though it sees blurrily with systematic distortions. We need, then, to apply the science to our intuitions, to use the abstract knowledge to correct our mental movements and augment our metacognitive skills. We are not writing a computer program to make a string puppet execute martial arts forms. It is our own mental limbs that we must move. Therefore, we must connect theory to practice. We must come to see what the science means for ourselves, for our daily inner lives. Availability. The availability heuristic is judging the frequency or probability of an event by the ease with which examples of the event come to mind. A famous 1978 study by Lichtenstein, Slovic, Fischoff, Lehman, and Combs judged frequency of lethal events, studied errors in quantifying the severity of risks, or judging which of two dangers occurred more frequently. Subjects thought that accidents caused about as many deaths as disease, thought that homicide was a more frequent cause of death than suicide. Actually, diseases cause about 16 times as many deaths as accident, and suicide is twice as frequent as homicide. An obvious hypothesis to account for these skewed beliefs is that murders are more likely to be talked about than suicides. Thus, someone is more likely to recall hearing about a murder than hearing about a suicide. Accidents are more dramatic than diseases. Perhaps this makes people more likely to remember or more likely to recall an accident. In 1979, a follow-up study by Combs and Slovak showed that the skewed probability judgments correlated strongly, 0.85 and 0.89, with skewed reporting frequencies in two newspapers. This doesn't disentangle whether mergers are more available to memory because they are more reported on, or whether newspapers report more on murders because murders are more vivid, hence also more remembered. But either way, an availability bias is at work. Selective reporting is one major source of availability biases. In the ancestral environment, much of what you knew, you experienced yourself, or you heard it directly from a fellow tribe member who had seen it. There was usually, at most, one layer of selective reporting between you and the event itself. With today's internet, you may see reports that have passed through the hands of 6 bloggers on the way to you, 6 successive filters. Compared to our ancestors, we live in a larger world, in which far more happens and far less of it reaches us. A much stronger selection effect, which can create much larger availability biases. In real life, you're unlikely to ever meet Bill Gates. But thanks to selective reporting by the media, you may be tempted to compare your life success to his, and suffer hedonic penalties accordingly. The objective frequency of Bill Gates is 0.0000000000015, but you hear about him much more often. Conversely, 19% of the planet lives on less than $1 a day, and I doubt that 1/5 of the blog posts you read are written by them. Using availability seems to give rise to an absurdity bias. Events that have never happened are not recalled and hence deemed to have probability 0. When no flooding has recently occurred, and yet the probabilities are still fairly calculable, people refuse to buy flood insurance, even when it is heavily subsidized and priced far below an actuarially fair value. Kunruther et al. Suggest underreaction to threats of flooding may arise from the inability of individuals to conceptualize floods that have never occurred. Men on floodplains appear to be very much prisoners of their experience. Recently experienced floods appear to set an upward bound to the size of loss with which managers believe they ought to be concerned. Burton et al. Report that when dams and levees are built, they reduce the frequency of floods and thus apparently create a false sense of security, leading to reduced precautions. While building dams decreases the frequency of floods, damage per flood is afterwards so much greater that average yearly damage increases. The wise would extrapolate from a memory of small hazards to the possibility of large hazards. Instead, past experience of small hazards seems to set a perceived upper bound on risk. A society well protected against minor hazard takes no action against major risks, building on floodplains once the regular minor floods are eliminated. A society subject to regular minor hazards treats those minor hazards as an upper bound of the size of the risks, guarding against regular minor floods, but not occasional major floods. Memory is not always a good guide to probabilities in the past, let alone in the future. Give me 1 second. Okay, I might just finish this section, which is 7 or so more essays, and then call it there. If you have to leave before then, that's fine, just let me know. What is a bias? The availability heuristic is a cognitive shortcut humans use to reach conclusions, and where this shortcut reliably causes inaccurate conclusions, we can say that an availability bias is at work. Scope insensitivity is another example of a cognitive bias. Cognitive biases are those obstacles to truth which are produced not by the cost of information, nor by limited computing power, but by the shape of our own mental machinery. For example, our mental processes might be evolutionarily adapted to specifically believe some things that aren't true, so that we could win political arguments in a tribal context. Or the mental machinery might be adapted not to particularly care whether something is true, such as when we feel the urge to believe what others believe to get along socially. Or the bias may be a side effect of a useful reasoning heuristic. The availability heuristic is not itself a bias, but it gives rise to them. The machinery uses an algorithm, give things more evidential weight if they come to mind more readily, that does some good cognitive work, but also produces systematic errors. Our brains are doing something wrong, and after a lot of experimentation and or heavy thinking, someone identifies the problem verbally and concretely. Then we call it a cognitive bias. Not to be confused with the colloquial "that person is biased," which just means that person has a skewed or prejudiced attitude towards something. In the cognitive science, biases are distinguished from errors that arise from cognitive content, such as learned false beliefs. These we call mistakes rather than biases, and they are much easier to correct once we've noticed them for ourselves, though the source of the mistake, or the source of the mistake, may ultimately be some bias. Biases are also distinguished from errors stemming from damage to an individual human brain or from absorbed cultural mores. Biases arise from machinery that is humanly universal. Plato wasn't biased because he was ignorant of general relativity. He had no way to gather that information. His ignorance did not arise from the shape of his mental machinery. But if Plato believed that philosophers would make better kings because he himself was a philosopher, and this belief in turn arose because of a universal adaptive political instinct for self-promotion, and not because Plato's daddy told him that everyone has a moral duty to promote their own profession to governorship, or because Plato sniffed too much glue as a kid, then that was a bias, whether Plato was ever warned of it or not. While I am not averse, as you can see, to discussing definitions, I don't want to suggest that the project of better wielding our own minds rests on a particular choice of terminology. If the term cognitive bias turns out to be unhelpful, we should just drop it. We don't start out with a moral duty to reduce bias, simply because biases are bad and evil and just not done. This is the sort of thinking someone might end up with if they acquired a deontological duty of rationality by social osmosis, which leads to people trying to execute techniques without appreciating the reason for them, which is bad and evil and just not done, according to Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, which I read as a kid. A bias is an obstacle to our goal of obtaining truth, and thus in our way. We are here to pursue the great human quest for truth, for we have desperate need of the knowledge, and besides, we're curious. To this end, let us strive to overcome whatever obstacles lie in our way, whether we call them biases or not. I quite like this joke. Just as a comment. Burdensome details. Merely corroborative detail intended to give artistic verisimilitude to an otherwise bald and unconvincing narrative. Pooh Bah in Gilbert and Sullivan's The Mikado. The conjunction fallacy is when humans assign a higher probability to a proposition of the form A and B than to one of the propositions A or B in isolation, even though it is a theorem that conjunctions are never likelier than their conjuncts. For example, in one experiment, 68% of the subjects ranked it more likely that Reagan will provide federal support for unwed mothers and cut federal support to local governments than that Reagan will provide federal support for unwed mothers. A long series of cleverly designed experiments which weeded out alternative hypotheses and nailed down the standard interpretation confirm that conjunction fallacy occurs because we substitute judgment of representativeness for judgment of probability. By adding extra details, you can make an outcome seem more characteristic of the process that generates it. You can make it sound more plausible that Reagan will support unwed mothers by adding the claim that Reagan will also cut support to local governments. The implausibility of one claim is compensated by the plausibility of the other. They average out. Which is to say, adding detail can make a scenario sound more plausible, even though the event necessarily becomes less probable. If so, then, hypothetically speaking, we might find futurists spinning unconscious. If so, then, hypothetically speaking, we might find futurists spinning unconscionably plausible and detailed future histories, or find people swallowing huge packages of unsupported claims bundled with a few strong-sounding assertions at the center. If you are presented with the conjunction fallacy in a naked, direct comparison, then you may succeed on that particular problem by consciously correcting yourself. But this is only slapping a band-aid on the problem, not fixing it in general. In the 1982 experiment, sorry, I lost my thread. In the 1982 experiment, where professional forecasters assigned systematically higher probabilities to Russia invades Poland, followed by suspension of diplomatic relations between the USA and the USSR, than to suspension of diplomatic relations between the USA and the USSR, each experimental group was only presented with one proposition. What strategy could these forecasters have followed as a group that would have eliminated the conjunction fallacy when no individual knew directly about the comparison? When no individual even knew that the experiment was about the conjunction fallacy, how could they have done better on their probability judgments? Patching one gotcha as a special case doesn't fix the general problem. The gotcha is the symptom, not the disease. What could the forecasters have done to avoid the conjunction fallacy without seeing the direct comparison, or even knowing that anyone was going to test them on the conjunction fallacy? It seems to me that they would need to notice the word and. They would need to be wary of it. Not just wary, but leap back from it. Even without knowing that researchers were afterward going to test them on the conjunction fallacy particularly. They would need to notice the conjunction of two entire details, and be shocked by the audacity of anyone asking them to endorse such an insanely complicated prediction. And they would need to penalize the probability substantially, a factor of 4, at least according to the experimental details. It might also have helped the forecasters to think about the possible reasons why the US and Soviet Union would suspend diplomatic relations. The scenario is not the US and Soviet Union suddenly suspend diplomatic relations for no reason, but the US and Soviet Union suspend diplomatic relations for any reason. And the subjects who rated Reagan will provide federal support for unwed mothers and cut federal support to local governments. Again, they would need to be shocked by the word and. Moreover, they would need to add absurdities, where the absurdity is the log probability, so you can add it, rather than averaging them. They would need to think Reagan might or might not cut support to local government 1 bit, but it seems very unlikely that he will support unwed mothers 4 bits. Total absurdity 5 bits. Or maybe Reagan won't support unwed mothers. 1 strike and it's out. The other proposition just makes it even worse. Similarly, consider Tarski and Kahneman's 1983 experiment based around a 6-sided die with 4 green faces and 2 red faces. The subjects had to bet on the sequence 1, red, green, red, 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 2, green, red, green, red, 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 or 3, green, red, 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 appearing anywhere in 20 rolls of the dice. 65% of the subjects chose GRGRRR, which is strictly dominated by RGRRR, since any sequence containing GRGRRR also pays off for RGRRR. How could the subjects have done better? By noticing the inclusion? Perhaps, but that's only a band-aid. It does not fix the fundamental problem. By explicitly calculating the probabilities, that would certainly fix the fundamental problem, but you can't always calculate an exact probability. The subjects lost heuristically by thinking, aha, sequence 2 has the highest proportion of green to red, I should bet on sequence 2. To win heuristically, the subjects would need to think, aha, sequence 1 is short, I should go with sequence 1. They would need to feel a stronger emotional impact from Occam's razor, feel every added detail as a burden, even a single extra roll of the dice. Once upon a time, I was speaking to someone who had been mesmerized by an incautious futurist, one who adds on lots of details that sound neat. I was trying to explain why I was not likewise mesmerized by these amazing, incredible theories. So I explained that the conjunction fallacy, specifically the suspending relations plus minus invading Poland experiment. And he said, okay, but what does that have to do with? And I said, it is more probable that universes replicate for any reason than that they replicate via black holes because advanced civilizations manufacture black holes because universes evolved to make them do it. And he said, oh. Until then, he had not felt these extra details as extra burdens. Instead, they were corroborative detail lending verisimilitude to the narrative. Someone presents you with a package of strange ideas, one of which is that universes replicate. Then they represent support for the assertion that universes replicate. But this is not support for the package, though it is all told as one story. You have to disentangle the details. You have to hold up every one independently and ask, how do we know this detail? Someone sketches out a picture of humanity's descent into nanotechnological warfare, where China refuses to abide by an international control agreement followed by an arms race. Wait a minute. How do you know it will be China? Is that a crystal ball in your pocket, or are you just happy to be a futurist? Where are all these details coming from? Where did that specific detail come from? For it is written, if you can lighten your burden, you must do so. There is no straw that lacks the power to break your back. What do we mean by rationality? I mean two things. One, epistemic rationality, systematically improving the accuracy of your beliefs. Two, instrumental rationality, systematically achieving your values. The first concept is simple enough. When you open your eyes and look at the room around you, you will locate your laptop in relation to the table, and you will locate a bookcase in relation to the wall. If something goes wrong with your eyes or your brain, then your mental model might say there's a bookcase where no bookcase exists, and when you go over to get a book, you will be disappointed. This is what it's like to have a false belief, a map of the world that doesn't correspond to the territory. Epistemic rationality is about building accurate maps instead. This correspondence between belief and rationality, this correspondence between belief and reality is commonly called truth, and I'm happy to call it that. Instrumental rationality, on the other hand, is about steering reality, sending the future where you want it to go. It's the art of choosing actions that lead to outcomes ranked higher in your preferences. I will sometimes call this winning. So, rationality is about forming true beliefs and making decisions that help you win. Where truth doesn't mean certainty, since we can do plenty to increase the probability that our beliefs are accurate, even though we are uncertain. And winning doesn't mean winning at others' expense, since our values include everything we care about, including other people. When people say X is rational, it's usually just a more strident way of saying I think X is true or I think X is good. So why have an additional word for rational as well as true and good? An analogous argument can be given against using true. There is no need to say it is true that snow is white when you could just say snow is white. What makes the idea of truth useful is that it allows us to talk about the general features of map territory correspondence. True models usually produce better experimental predictions than false models, is a useful generalization, and is not one you can make without using a concept like true or accurate. Similarly, rational agents make decisions that maximize the probabilistic expectation of a coherent utility function is the kind of thought that depends on the concept of instrumental rationality, whereas it's rational to eat vegetables can probably be replaced with it's useful to eat vegetables or it's in your interest to eat vegetables. We need a concept like rational in order to note general facts about those ways of thinking that systematically produce truth or value and the systematic ways in which we fall short of those standards. As we've observed in the previous essays, experimental psychologists sometimes uncover human reasoning that seems very strange. For example, someone rates the probability Bill plays jazz as less than the probability Bill is an accountant who plays jazz. This seems like an odd judgment, since any particular jazz-playing accountant is obviously a jazz player. But to what higher vantage point do we appeal in saying the judgment is wrong? Experimental psychologists use two gold standards: probability theory and decision theory. Probability theory is the set of laws underlying rational belief. The mathematics of probability applies equally to figuring out where your bookcase is and estimating how many hairs were on Julius Caesar's head, even though our evidence for the claim Julius Caesar was bald is likely to be more complicated and indirect than our evidence for the claim there's a bookcase in my room. It's all the same problem of how to process the evidence and observations to update one's beliefs. Similarly, decision theory is the set of laws underlying rational action, and is equally applicable regardless of what one's goals and available options are. Let P such and such stand for the probability that such and such happens, and P A comma B for the probability that both A and B happen. Since it is a universal law of probability theory that probability of A is greater than or equal to probability of A comma B, the judgment that Bill plays jazz, the judgment that P of Bill plays jazz is less than P of Bill plays jazz, comma, Bill is an accountant, is labeled incorrect. To keep it technical, you would say that this probability judgment is non-Bayesian. Beliefs that conform to a coherent probability distribution and decisions that maximize the probabilistic expectation of a coherent utility function are called Bayesian. I should emphasize that this isn't the notion of rationality that's common in popular culture. People may use the same string of sounds, rational, to refer to acting like Mr. Spock of Star Trek and acting like a Bayesian, but this doesn't mean that acting Spock-like helps one hair with epistemic or instrumental rationality. All of this does not quite exhaust the problem of what is meant in practice by rationality, for two major reasons. First, the Bayesian formalism in their full form are computationally intractable in most real-world problems. No one can actually calculate and obey the math any more than you can predict the stock market by calculating the movements of quarks. This is why there is a site called Less Wrong rather than a simple This is why there is a whole site called Less Wrong rather than a single page that simply states the formal axioms and calls it a day. There is a further art to finding the truth and accomplishing value from inside a human mind. We have to learn our own flaws, overcome our biases, prevent ourselves from self-deceiving, get ourselves into good emotional shape to confront the truth and do what needs doing, etc., etc. Second, sometimes the meaning of the math itself is called into question. The exact rules of probability theory are called into question by, for example, anthropic problems in which the number of observers is uncertain. The exact rules of decision theory are called into question by, for example, Newcomb-like problems in which other agents may predict your decision before it happens. In cases where our best formalizations still come up short, we can return to simpler ideas like truth and winning. If you are a scientist just beginning to investigate fire, it might be a lot wiser to point to a campfire and say, fire is that orangey bright hot stuff over there, rather than saying, I define fire as an alchemical transmutation of substances which releases phlogiston. You certainly shouldn't ignore something just because you can't define it. I can't quote the equations of general relativity from memory, but nonetheless, if I walk off a cliff, I will fall. And we can say the same of cognitive biases and other obstacles to truth. They won't hit any less hard if it turns out we can't define compactly what irrationality is. In cases like these, it is futile to try to settle the problem by coming up with some new definition of the word rational and saying, therefore, my preferred answer by definition is what is meant by the word rational. This simply raises the question of why anyone should pay attention to your definition. I'm not interested in probability theory because it is the holy word handed down from Laplace. I am interested in Bayesian-style belief updating with Occam priors because I expect this style of thinking gets us systematically closer to, accuracy, the map that reflects the territory. And then there are questions of how to think that seem not quite answered by either probability theory or decision theory, like the question of how to feel about the truth once you have it. Here, again, trying to define rationality a particular way doesn't support an answer, but merely presumes one. I'm not here to argue the meaning of a word, not even if that word is rationality. The point of attaching sequences of letters to particular concepts is to let two people communicate, to help transport thoughts from one mind to another. You cannot change reality or prove the thought by manipulating which meanings go with which words. So if you understand what concept I am generally getting at with this word rationality, and with the subterms epistemic rationality and instrumental rationality, we have communicated. We have accomplished everything there is to accomplish by talking about how to define rationality. What's left to discuss is not what meaning to attach to the syllables rationality. What's left to discuss is what is a good way to think. If you say it's epistemically rational for me to believe X, but the truth is Y, then you are probably using the word rational to mean something other than what I have in mind. For example, rationality should be consistent under reflection. Rationally looking at the evidence and rationally considering how your mind processes the evidence shouldn't lead to two different conclusions. Similarly, if you find yourself saying, the instrumentally rational thing for me to do is X, but the right thing for me to do is Y, then you're almost certainly using some other meaning for the word rational with the word right. I use the term rationality normatively to pick out desirable patterns of thought. In this case, or in any other case where people disagree about word meanings, you should substitute more specific language in place of rational. The self-benefiting thing to do is to run away, but I hope I would at least try to drag the child off the railroad tracks. Or, causal decision theory, as usually formulated, says you should 2-box on Newcomb's problem, but I would rather have $1 million. In fact, I recommend reading back through this essay, replacing every instance of rational with fusel, and seeing if that changes the connotations of what I'm saying any. If so, I say strive not for rationality, but for fusality. The word rational has potential pitfalls, but there are plenty of non-borderline cases where rational works fine to communicate what I'm getting at. Likewise, irrational. In these cases, I'm not afraid to use it. Yet, one should be careful not to overuse that word. One receives no points merely for pronouncing it loudly. If you speak over much of the way, you will not attain it. Planning fallacy. The Denver International Airport opened 16 months late at a cost overrun of $2 billion. The Eurofighter Typhoon, a joint defense project of several European countries, was delivered 54 months late at a cost of $19 billion instead of $7 billion. The Sydney Opera House may be the most legendary construction overrun of all time, originally estimated to be completed in 1963 for $7 million, and finally completed in 1973 for $102 million. Are these isolated disasters brought to our attention by selective availability? Are they symptoms of bureaucracy or government incentive failures? Yes, very probably. But there's also a corresponding cognitive bias, replicated in experiments with individual planners. Bueller et al. Asked their students for estimates of when they, the students, thought they would complete their personal academic projects. Specifically, the researchers asked for estimated times for which the students thought it was 50%, 75%, and 99% probable their personal projects would be done. Would you care to guess how many students finished on or before their estimated 50%, 75%, and 99% probability levels? Well, 13% of subjects finished their project by the time they had assigned a 50% probability level. 19% finished by the time assigned a 75% probability level, and only 45%, less than half, finished by the time of their 99% probability level. As Buehler et al. Wrote, the results for the 99% probability level are especially striking. Even when asked to make a highly conservative forecast, a prediction that they felt virtually certain that they would fulfill, students' confidence in their time estimates far exceeded their accomplishments. More generally, this phenomenon is known as the planning fallacy. The planning fallacy is that people think they can plan. Haha. A clue to the underlying problem with the planning algorithm was uncovered by Newby Clark et al., who found that asking subjects for their predictions based on realistic best guess scenarios and asking subjects for their hoped for best case scenarios produced indistinguishable results. When people are asked for a realistic scenario, they envision everything going exactly as planned with no unexpected delays or unforeseen catastrophes, the same vision as their best case. Reality, it turns out, usually delivers results somewhat worse than the worst case. Unlike most cognitive biases, we know a good debiasing heuristic for the planning fallacy. It won't work for messes on the scale of the Denver International Airport, but it'll work for a lot of personal planning and even some small-scale organizational stuff. Just use an outside view instead of an inside view. People tend to generate their predictions by thinking about the particular, unique features of the task at hand and constructing a scenario for how they intend to complete the task, which is just what we usually think of as planning. When you want to get something done, you have to plan out where, when, how, figure out how much time and how much resource is required, visualize the steps from beginning to successful conclusion. And all this is the inside view, and it doesn't take into account unexpected delays and unforeseen catastrophes. As we saw before, asking people to visualize the worst case still isn't enough to counteract their optimism. They don't visualize enough Murphiness. Reader's note, Murphy's law is everything will be worse than you can predict. Or things will take longer than you think they will, even when you take Murphy's law into account. One of those two. The outside view is when you deliberately avoid thinking about the special, unique features of this project and just ask how long it took to finish broadly similar projects in the past. This is counterintuitive, since the inside view has so much more detail. There's a temptation to think that a carefully tailored prediction, taking into account all available data, will give better results. But experiment has shown that the more detailed subject's visualization, the more optimistic and less accurate they become. Buehler et al. Asked an experimental group of subjects to describe highly specific plans for their Christmas shopping. Where, when, and how. On average, this group expected to finish shopping more than a week before Christmas. Another group was simply asked when they expected to finish their Christmas shopping, with an average response of 4 days. Both groups finished an average of 3 days before Christmas. Likewise, Buehler et al., reporting on a cross-cultural study, found that Japanese students expected to finish their essays 10 days before deadline. They actually finished 1 day before deadline. Asked when they had previously completed similar tasks, they responded 1 day before deadline. This is the power of the outside view over the inside view. A similar finding is that experienced outsiders who know less of the details but who have relevant memory to draw upon are often much less optimistic and much more accurate than the actual planners and implementers. So there is a fairly reliable way to fix the planning fallacy. If you're doing something broadly similar to a reference class of previous projects, just ask how long similar projects have taken in the past, without considering any of the special properties of this project. Better yet, ask an experienced outsider how long similar projects have taken. You'll get back an answer that sounds hideously long and clearly reflects no understanding of the special reasons why this particular task will take less time. This answer is true. Deal with it. Why truth? The goal of instrumental rationality mostly speaks for itself. Some commenters have wondered, on the other hand, why rationalists care about truth, which invites a few different answers depending on who you ask. and these different answers have different characters which can shape the search for truth in different ways. You might hold the view that pursuing truth is inherently noble, important, and worthwhile, in which case your priorities will be determined by your ideals about which truths are most important, or about when truth-seeking is most virtuous. This motivation tends to have a moral character to it. If you think it your duty to look behind the curtain, you are a lot more likely to believe someone else should look behind the curtain too, or castigate them if they deliberately close their eyes. I tend to be suspicious of morality as a motivation for rationality, not because I reject a moral ideal, but because it invites certain kinds of trouble. It is too easy to acquire, as learned moral duties, modes of thinking that are dreadful missteps in the dance. Consider Spock, the naive archetype of rationality. Spock's affect is always set to calm, even when wildly inappropriate. He often gives many significant digits for probabilities that are grossly uncalibrated. Yet this popular image is how many people conceive of the duty to be rational. Small wonder that they do not embrace it wholeheartedly. To make rationality into a moral duty is to give it all the dreadful degrees of freedom of an arbitrary tribal custom. People arrive at the wrong answer and then indignantly protest that they acted with propriety rather than learning from their mistake. What other motives are there? Well, you might want to accomplish some specific real-world goal, like building an airplane, and therefore you need to know some specific truths about aerodynamics. Or, more mundanely, you want chocolate milk, and therefore you want to know whether the local grocery has chocolate milk, so you can choose whether to walk there or somewhere else. If this is the reason you want truth, then the priority you assign to your questions will reflect the expected utility of their information, how much the possible answers influence your choices, how much your choices matter, and how much you expect to find an answer that changes your choice from its default. To seek truth merely for its instrumental value may seem impure. Should we not desire the truth for its own sake? But such investigations are extremely important because they create an outside criterion of verification. If your airplane drops out of the sky, or if you get to the store and find no chocolate milk, it's a hint that you did something wrong. You get back feedback on which modes of thinking work and which don't. Another possibility. You might care about what's true because, damn it, you're curious. As a reason to seek truth, curiosity has a special and admirable purity. If your motive is curiosity, you will assign priority to questions according to how the questions themselves tickle your aesthetic sense. A trickier challenge with a greater probability of failure may be worth more effort than a simpler one, just because it's more fun. Curiosity and morality can both attach an intrinsic value to truth. Yet, being curious about what's behind the curtain is a very different state of mind from believing that you have a moral duty to look there. If you're curious, your priorities will be determined by which truths you find most intriguing, not most important or most useful. Although pure curiosity is a wonderful thing, it may not linger too long on verifying its answer once the attractive mystery is gone. Curiosity as a human emotion has been around since long before the ancient Greeks, but what set humanity firmly on the path of science was noticing that certain modes of thinking uncovered beliefs that let us manipulate the world. Truth as an instrument. As far as sheer curiosity goes, spinning campfire tales of gods and heroes satisfied that desire just as well, and no one realized that anything was wrong with that. At the same time, if we are going to improve our skills of rationality, go beyond the standards of performance set by hunter-gatherers, we'll need deliberate beliefs about how to think, things that look like norms of rationalist propriety. When we write new mental programs for ourselves, they start out as explicit injunctions, and are only slowly, if ever, trained into the neural circuitry that underlies our core motivations and habits. Curiosity, pragmatism, and quasi-moral injunctions are all key to the rationalist project. Yet if you were to ask me which of these is most foundational, I would say curiosity. I have my principles, and I have my plans, which may well tell me to look behind the curtain. But then, I also just really want to know. What will I see? The world has handed me a puzzle, and the solution feels tantalizingly close. Feeling rational. Since curiosity is an emotion, I suspect that some people will object to treating curiosity as a part of rationality. A popular belief about rationality is that rationality opposes all emotion, that all our sadness and all our joy are automatically anti-logical by virtue of being feelings. Yet, strangely enough, I can't find any theorem of probability theory which proves that I should appear ice cold and expressionless. When people think of emotion and rationality as opposed, I suspect that they are really thinking of System 1 and System 2, fast perceptual judgments versus slow deliberative judgments. System 2's deliberative judgments aren't always true, and System 1's perceptual judgments aren't always false. So it is very important to distinguish that dichotomy from rationality. Both systems can serve the goal of truth or defeat it, depending on how they're used. For my part, I label an emotion as not rational if it rests on mistaken beliefs, or rather on mistake-producing epistemic conduct. If the iron approaches your face and you believe it is hot and it is cool, the way opposes your fear. If the iron approaches your face and you believe it is cool and it is hot, the way opposes your calm. Conversely, an emotion that is evoked by correct beliefs or truth-conducive thinking is a rational emotion, and this has the advantage of letting us regard calm as an emotional state, rather than a privileged default. So is rationality orthogonal to feeling? No, our emotions arise from our models of reality. If I believe that my dead brother has been discovered alive, I will be happy. If I wake up and realize it was a dream, I will be sad. P.C. Hodgel said, "That which can be destroyed by the truth should be." My dreaming self-happiness was opposed by truth. My sadness on waking is rational. There is no truth which destroys it. Rationality begins by asking how the world is, but spreads virally to any other thought which depends on how we think the world is. Your beliefs about how the world is can concern anything you think is out there in reality, anything that either does or does not exist. Any member of the class things that can make other things happen. If you believe that there is a goblin in your closet that ties your shoes' laces together, then this is a belief about how the world is. Your shoes are real. You can pick them up. If there's something out there that can reach out and tie your shoelaces together, it must be real too, part of the vast web of causes and effects we call the universe. Feeling angry at the goblin who tied your shoelaces involves a state of mind that is not just about how the world is. Suppose that, as a Buddhist or lobotomy patient or just a very phlegmatic person, finding your shoelaces tied together didn't make you angry. This wouldn't affect what you expected to see in the world. You would still expect to open up your closet and find your shoelaces tied together. Your anger or calm shouldn't affect your best guess here, because what happens in your closet doesn't depend on your emotional state of mind, though it may take some effort to think that clearly. But the angry feeling is tangled up with a state of mind that is about how the world is. You become angry because you think the goblin tied your shoelaces. The criterion of rationality spreads virally from the initial question of whether or not a goblin tied your shoelaces to the resulting anger. Becoming more rational, arriving at better estimates of how the world is, can diminish feelings or intensify them. Sometimes you run away from strong feelings by denying the facts, by flinching away from the view of the one that gave rise to the powerful emotion. If so, then as you study the skills of rationality and train yourself not to deny facts, your feelings will become stronger. In my early days, I was never quite certain whether it was all right to feel things strongly, whether it was allowed, whether it was proper. I do not think this confusion arose only from my youthful misunderstanding of rationality. I have observed similar troubles in people who do not even aspire to be rationalists. When they are happy, they wonder if they are really allowed to be happy, and when they are sad, they are never quite sure whether to run away from the emotion or not. Since the days of Socrates at least, and probably long before, the way to appear cultured and sophisticated has been to never let anyone see you care strongly about anything. It's embarrassing to feel. It's just not done in polite society. You should see the strange looks I get when people realize how much I care about rationality. It's not the unusual subject, I think, but that they're not used to seeing sane adults who visibly care about anything. But I know now that there's nothing wrong with feeling strongly. Ever since I adopted the rule of that which can be destroyed by the truth should be, I've also come to realize that that which the truth nourishes should thrive. When something good happens, I'm happy, and there's no confusion in my mind about whether it is rational for me to be happy. When something terrible happens, I do not flee my sadness by searching for fake consolations and false silver linings. I visualize the past and future of humankind, the tens of billions of deaths over our history, the misery and fear, the search for answers, the trembling hands reaching upward out of so much blood. What we could become someday when we make the stars our cities, all that darkness and all that light. I know that I can never truly understand it, and I haven't the words to say. Despite all my philosophy, I am still embarrassed to confess strong emotions, and you're probably uncomfortable hearing them. But I know now that it is rational to feel. The lens that sees its flaws. Light leaves the sun and strikes your shoelaces and bounces off. Some photons enters the pupils of your eyes and strike your retina. The energy of the photons triggers neural impulses. The neural impulses are transmitted to the visual processing areas of the brain, and there the optical information is processed and reconstructed into a 3D model that is recognized as an untied shoelace, and so you believe that your shoelaces are untied. Here is the secret of deliberate rationality. This whole process is not magic, and you can understand it. You can understand how you see your shoelaces. You can think about which sort of thinking processes will create beliefs which mirror reality, and which thinking processes will not. Mice can see, but they can't understand seeing. You can understand seeing, and because of that, you can do things that mice cannot do. Take a moment to marvel at this, for it is indeed marvelous. Mice see, but they don't know they have visual cortexes, so they can't correct for optical illusions. A mouse lives in a mental world that includes cats, holes, cheese, and mouse traps, but not mouse brains. Their camera does not take pictures of its own lens. But we as humans can look at a seemingly bizarre image and realize that part of what we are seeing is the lens itself. You don't always have to believe your own eyes, but you have to realize that you have eyes. You must have distinct mental buckets for the map and the territory, for the senses and reality. Lest you think this is a trivial ability, remember how rare it is in the animal kingdom. The whole idea of science is simply reflective reasoning about a more reliable process for making the contents of your mind mirror the contents of the world. It is the sort of thing mice would never invent. Pondering this business of performing replicable experiments to falsify theories, we can see why it works. Science is not a separate magisterium, far away from real life and the understanding of ordinary mortals. Science is not something that only applies to the inside of laboratories. Science itself is an understandable process in the world that correlates brains with reality. Science makes sense when you think about it. But mice can't think about thinking, which is why they don't have science. One should not overlook the wonder of this, or the potential power it bestows on us as individuals, not just scientific societies. Admittedly, understanding the engine of thought may be a little more complicated than understanding a steam engine, but it is not a fundamentally different task. Once upon a time, I went to EFNet's philosophy chatroom to ask, do you believe a nuclear war will occur in the next 20 years? If no, why not? One person who answered the question said he didn't expect a nuclear war for 100 years, because all of the players involved in decisions regarding nuclear war are not interested right now. But why extend this out for 100 years? I asked. Pure hope, was his reply. Reflecting on this whole thought process, we can see why the thought of nuclear war makes the person unhappy, and we can see how his brain therefore rejects the belief. But if you imagine a billion worlds, Everett branches, or Tegmark duplicates, this thought process will not systematically correlate optimists to branches in which no nuclear war occurs. To ask which beliefs make you happy is to turn inward, not outward. It tells you something about yourself. but it is not evidence entangled with the environment. I have nothing against happiness, but it should follow from your picture of the world rather than tampering with the mental paintbrushes. If you can see this, if you can see that hope is shifting your first order thoughts by too large a degree, if you can understand your mind as a mapping engine that has flaws, then you can apply a reflective correction. The brain is a flawed lens through which to see reality. This is true of both mouse brains and human brains. But a human brain is a flawed lens that can understand its own flaws, its systematic errors, its biases, and apply second order corrections to them. This, in practice, makes the lens far more powerful. Not perfect, but far more powerful. That is the end of that little sequence and will be the end of the stream today. Thank you very much for listening.